Hello, my name is Gallo, Zian, and today we'll be discussing Pablo Baudetta's paper titled Birds of the Same Feather Tweet Together, Bayesian Ideal Point Estimations Using Twitter Data. The overarching understanding of this paper is that it looks to leverage Twitter data to figure out where in the American political spectrum a particular Twitter user may exist.
The hypothesis they also makes is whether leveraging the Twitter data will allow us to understand what kind of political actors a Twitter user might follow, which is where someone exists in the political spectrum. And here they also use the Twitter data. It had three main advantages. The first is since Twitter has a large number of users around the world, a large sample can give us more accuracy. And the second one is a dynamic structure, also allows for a great deal of accuracy through the estimation. The third one is we can link the Twitter profile to other data like Instagram to explore more on the profile of user of the whole social network. On the other side, there might also be the disadvantages. Since we are using a small sample of the online American users, they're using the sample of the sample. The Twitter data might not represent the whole voting population. What to connect in the data? They also use the API from the Twitter. Since following someone is costly, as exposed a user personal information to a new user, who in this study will be a political actor, and also allows for the estimation of ideal points with standard error on a continuous scale. And third, it can be conducted on a large set of Twitter users and allows for analysis to be conducted regardless of the country. And here, they also makes the assumption that the Twitter user will choose to follow politicians to do so because they support this similar ideological framework. It's not like they have the very opposite ideological, but they follow them just because they want to tease them or stand against them, stuff like that. And here the selective exposure theories from the article we can see it argues that individuals exhibit preference for opinion reinforcing political information and that they systematically avoid the opinion challenges. And the data, they also select data from 6 countries. Here the M represents the political actors. It should be have more than 5,000 followers or 2,000 followers in the other countries, and you get the corresponding numbers of political actors from each countries. And for the users, you also need to have more than 100 tweets and last for more than 6 months and have more than 25 followers, and should be political active to have more than to follow more than 3 political actors. And it also has a corresponding number of Twitter users from each countries. And here the estimate given in the study is the probability that given Twitter user will follow a politician. And for the model, it's basically a Bayes model, and to get the probability that whether a user will follow a political actor. 1 means yes and 0 means no. And there are other parameters like the popularity of the politician, the user interest in politics, and the ideal point of Twitter user and the ideal point for the politician, and also the council. Here, and Mark will explore more on the graphs from the.
Thank you so much. So, from the statistical findings, we can get some graphical outputs. And what we see is that before diving too deep in anything, we do see that the House and the Senate are separated by their ideology. So we have an x-axis spanning from 0 outward to -2 and 2 on both sides. Those on -2 tend to identify to be more liberal. Those on +2 tend to identify to be more conservative. And what we see specifically in the House is a good amount of clustering in each of those ideological spectrums. In the Senate, you have a little bit more of a diverse sampling because you do have some independents and you do have some Democrats and Republicans near that 0 mark. And you also do have independents on the poles of the graphs as well. So you do see that clustering that Barbera is looking to point out. If you could go to the next one. Thank you. So now this was of particular interest to me with reference to all of this. So we have a lot of clustering of people, we have a clustering of ideologies, but are the people who are clustering, are the users themselves clustering in the same manner as the political actors? What the study seems to find is that's not the case. What we see is the political actors, there's a lot of them surrounding this conservative ideology, or this liberal ideology, and there's a lot of them surrounding this conservative ideology. But there's not a lot of political actors in the Senate. But what we do see is ordinary users, we see a tremendous quantity of people in the Senate. This begins to suggest that the clustering in the politics might not be clustering in the same manner that the ordinary user is. When we look at ideal points though, we do see that the ideologies are pretty common throughout the clusterings. So conservatives tend to operate on the more conservative end of the spectrum, liberals on the more liberal end of the spectrum, and moderates in the center. So we do have a diversity of ideology in terms of the 3 things we can leverage, but we do not have an equal proportion of diversity with regard to the actors and the ordinary users, because we see primarily actors only existing on the poles of ideology. So here, this is without regard to the Twitter data. We see that, or yes, forgive me, we do see a Twitter ideological estimate, and we see, again, just in a different geographical representation, that there is a tendency to be liberal and a tendency to be conservative that is a little more extreme than the entire graphical representation here. You do have a significant amount more samples, and they do operate within the same, they do operate surrounding the same mean. However, we do see a fairly high 3rd quadrant on our top one here, and a fairly low 1st quadrant on our Twitter reference here, where we do have a decent amount of fluctuation throughout the registration history graphical representation as a whole. So a little bit of difference between the 2 perspectives. And then here, this is one of my most favorite one, because I've noticed that on Twitter, people can become very, to say it lightly, spicy. They can go at one another pretty quickly. What we do see is that based on how people are tweeting and how they're identifying based on their ideology, you see that those who identify as conservative tweeted a tremendous amount about Obama. And those who identify as liberal tweeted much more so about Romney than they ever did compared to the conservatives tweeting about Romney. So you see when tweets about Obama coming primarily from conservatives and tweets about Romney coming primarily from liberals, it begins to suggest what type of dialogue is going on Twitter if people who identify with the opposite end of the spectrum are constantly tweeting about their opponent. It's likely highly critical, which I believe that if anyone who participates on Twitter knows that Twitter can be a very critical platform when trying to discuss ideologies, as people can get, without a ton of context, very taken aback by things that are said. So I thought that was very interesting finding regarding the Twitter data. And then here we just have the quantity of tweets. What we do see is that people, with regard to Obama, on the conservative end, a lot more density, you see a lot more tweeting going on. And same with Romney. On the liberals, you see a greater density of tweets going on. So a larger quantity of tweets is going on with respect to the opponent when you're in a given political party. So just basing that off of the previous graph that was presented. And pretty much what this research was able to find is that using Twitter data, you can separate people by their political ideology. You can cluster them and begin to develop an understanding based on who we follow, the bios that we have, how we tweet, etc. All these type of things can be validated through comparing traditional means of understanding where one would exist within a political spectrum and their usage on Twitter. So this opens up a ton of new information that we could leverage. We could use Twitter to understand so many different things about people, and especially with regard to the political ideology, because it is professed so much on social media. So there's a lot more questions that could be possible to answer now, and this is definitely one of the new pieces of research that will be very interesting going forward. And that's it for me.